like a sanctuary. It was a day I had dreamed of since I was a little girl. My wedding day. The sun was casting a golden glow over the garden, where rows of white chairs faced a beautifully adorned arch. I stood there in my flowing gown, feeling like a character out of a fairy tale. My heart fluttered with excitement, but a shadow of unease lingered in the back of my mind. As I walked down the aisle, my eyes searched for him, my soon-to-be husband, Mark. He stood there, handsome as ever in his sharp suit, but his eyes didn't hold the sparkle I expected. They darted around, restless and clouded with something I couldn't quite place. Was it just nerves? I tried to convince myself it was. After the ceremony, as we mingled with our guests, I caught Mark's arm. "You seemed miles away during the vows. Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice laced with concern. He forced a smile, his hand gently squeezing mine. "It's just weddings, you know. They can be overwhelming. But I'm fine, Emily." Really, he reassured me, but his words felt hollow. Later, as we sat at our table, I tried again. "Mark, this is supposed to be the happiest day of our lives. I just want to make sure you're truly happy." He looked at me, his expression softening. "Emily, I am happy. It's just all this. It's a lot. But I'm with you, and that's all that matters." His words were the right ones, but something in his tone didn't sit right with me. The rest of the evening was a blur of dancing, laughter, and celebration. Yet, amidst the joy, my mind kept returning to Mark's distant demeanor. It was as if a small crack had appeared in our perfect day, a crack I couldn't ignore. As we drove off to our honeymoon, his hand found mine, and he squeezed it tightly. "I love you, Emily. You know that, right?" he said, his voice earnest. "I love you too, Mark," I replied, wanting to believe that everything was fine. But deep down, I knew our journey was starting on an uncertain note, a note that would echo in the days to come. The initial weeks of our marriage were like living inside a dream. Mark and I settled into my cozy house, turning it into our home. The mornings were filled with shared laughter over breakfast, and the evenings were quiet, intimate affairs. I was working at a large corporation, a job that I loved and that paid well. Mark, on the other hand, was part of a small startup. His earnings were modest, but he seemed passionate about his work. As time went by, a subtle shift began to take place. Mark started staying late at work more often than not. At first, it seemed understandable. Startup life can be demanding. But when he began coming home late at night, sometimes reeking of alcohol, worry started to gnaw at me. One evening, as we sat down for a rare dinner together, I decided to broach the subject. "Mark, I've noticed you've been coming home late a lot. And sometimes you've had too much to drink. Is everything okay at work?" I asked, trying to keep my voice gentle. He looked up, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "It's just work, Emily. You know how it is. Deadlines, meetings, and sometimes we go out for drinks. It's nothing to worry about." "But I do worry, Mark. I miss spending time with you. Can't you come home earlier?" I pressed, my concern growing. Mark let out a sigh, his fork clattering against his plate. "I can't just leave work, Emily. You wouldn't understand. Your job is so structured. Mine isn't like that." I felt a sting at his words. "I just miss you, that's all," I murmured, feeling a chasm growing between us. As the pattern continued, our conversations about his late nights became more frequent and heated. One night, when he came home particularly late, I couldn't hold back my frustration. "This has to stop, Mark. You're coming home late every night, and half the time you're drunk. What's going on?" Mark's response was sharp and quick. "I'm just trying to keep my job, Emily. Maybe if you were a bit more understanding, this wouldn't be such a problem." I recoiled at his words, a mixture of hurt and anger bubbling inside me. Understanding? I've been nothing but supportive. But this is not just about work, is it? He didn't answer, just walked away, leaving me standing in the silent kitchen, my heart heavy with a growing sense of dread. I knew something was deeply wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was as if Mark was slipping away from me, and I was powerless to stop it. The warmth that once filled our home now felt like a distant memory. Mark's late nights became the norm, and our conversations dwindled to brief, cold exchanges. The distance between us felt like a tangible, suffocating fog, thickening with each passing day. One evening, as I sat alone at the dinner table with 2 plates of food growing cold, the weight of our strained relationship pressed heavily on me. When Mark finally walked in, the clock had long struck midnight. His steps were unsteady, his eyes avoiding mine. "Mark, we need to talk." "This can't go on," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but laden with emotion. He slumped into a chair, running his hands through his hair. Not now, Emily. I'm tired. It's always the same conversation. But it's a conversation we need to have. You're out every night, and I don't even know who you are anymore. My voice rose, a mix of frustration and hurt. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm the same person, Emily. I'm just trying to make a living. Why can't you see that? His voice was a mix of defensiveness and exhaustion. I reached out to him, my own anger subsiding into worry. Is it just work, Mark, or is there something else? Something you're not telling me? He shook his head, avoiding my gaze. There's nothing else. It's just stress, that's all. But his words did little to quell the storm of doubts in my mind. Our home no longer felt like a sanctuary, but rather a silent battleground fraught with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. In an effort to find some clarity, I confided in my closest friend, Sarah, over coffee one weekend. I just don't know what to do anymore. It feels like he's slipping away from me, I confessed, the worry evident in my voice. Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering mine. Have you thought about seeing a counselor? Maybe it could help to talk things out, get some professional advice. I sighed, considering the suggestion. I've thought about it, but I'm not even sure Mark would agree to go. He doesn't think there's a problem. You can't just keep going on like this. You deserve to be happy, and it's clear you're not, Sarah said, her concern for me evident. I nodded, knowing she was right, but the thought of confronting the issues head-on filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. As the days turned into weeks, the gap between Mark and me grew wider. Conversations were now limited to necessities, and the laughter and warmth that once filled our home were replaced by a chilling silence. One night, as we lay in bed, backs turned to each other, I whispered into the darkness, Mark, are we okay? There was a long pause before he replied, his voice hollow. I don't know, Emily. His words echoed in the stillness of the room, mirroring the uncertainty that lay in my heart. The strain was not just growing, it was tearing us apart, and I was at a loss on how to mend the widening rift. The turning point came unexpectedly. It was a bleak Thursday morning when Mark received the call that his father had passed away. I watched him crumble under the weight of the news, his face pale and his hands trembling. Despite our strained relationship, my heart ached for him. As he prepared for the funeral, Mark was unusually silent, his grief a quiet storm raging within him. I offered my support, wanting to be there for him, but he was adamant. Emily, I need to do this alone. Please, don't come to the funeral, he said, his voice strained. But why? I want to support you through this, I protested, confused and hurt by his request. It's just complicated, family stuff. Reluctantly, I agreed, though his insistence gnawed at me. But as the day of the funeral approached, curiosity and concern overpowered me. I decided to attend unbeknownst to Mark. I arrived at the funeral a little late, staying towards the back to avoid being noticed. The service was somber, the air heavy with grief. I scanned the crowd for Mark and found him standing beside a young woman I had never seen before. She was leaning into him, her hand resting gently on his arm in a way that was unmistakably intimate. My heart sank as I watched them, a cold realization dawning on me. I approached them quietly, my mind racing. Mark's eyes widened in shock as he saw me, the color draining from his face. I beckoned him aside, my voice calm but firm. We need to talk, but not here. We'll discuss this at home. He nodded, his expression one of horror and guilt. As I left the funeral, the image of them together burned in my mind, confirming the fears I had been pushing away. The drive home was a blur of emotions. I felt betrayed, angry, and foolish all at once. I was reeling from the revelation, but knew I had to confront Mark and uncover the truth. When he returned home later, his face was a mask of dread. Emily, I cut him off, my voice ice cold. Explain what? That you've been having an affair? That all those late nights weren't just about work? He winced at my words, his guilt evident. It's not what you think. I was going to tell you, but... But what, Mark? That you couldn't find the right time, or that you were too cowardly to face the consequences of your actions? He looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I'm sorry, Emily. I never meant to hurt you. The words hung in the air, hollow and inadequate. The revelation at the funeral was more than just the uncovering of an affair. It was the shattering of trust, the breaking of a bond I thought was unbreakable. As I stood there, Looking at the man I thought I knew, I realized that our marriage was beyond salvaging. The man I married had vanished, replaced by a stranger I could no longer trust. The house felt colder than ever as the reality of Mark's betrayal settled in. I sat in the living room, the silence deafening, waiting for him to come back from the funeral. The image of him with that woman replayed in my mind, each loop a fresh cut to my heart. When Mark finally walked through the door, his face was a mix of guilt and fear. He hesitated at the entrance, as if unsure whether he was still welcome in what used to be our sanctuary. "Emily, He started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Save it, Mark. I saw you at the funeral. With her. How long has it been going on?" My voice was steady, but inside I was a tempest of emotions. He sighed, a resigned look on his face. "A few months. I just did. Do you hear yourself? You make it sound like an accident," I exclaimed, my composure cracking. He moved closer, but I stepped back. "Emily, I'm sorry. I know I've hurt you. I never wanted to." "To get caught," I interjected bitterly. "Or to hurt me, because Mark, you've managed to do both." He looked down, unable to face my gaze. "I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I am, truly." I shook my head, disbelief and anger swirling within me. "Sorry doesn't even begin to cover it, Mark. You've been lying to me, sneaking around. How could you do this to us?" He tried to reach out, his voice breaking. "Emily, please. I know I've messed up, but I love you. We can fix this." I recoiled from his touch, my decision clear. "Fix this. There's nothing left to fix, Mark. You've broken everything. Us, our marriage, my trust." I walked over to the hallway and picked up a suitcase. "I've packed your things. You need to leave." Mark's face crumbled in disbelief. "You're throwing me out?" "Yes, Mark. I am. You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine. I can't be with someone I can't trust." He stood there stunned as I handed him the suitcase. "Where will I go?" he asked, a note of desperation in his voice. "That's not my problem anymore, Mark. You should have thought about that before." As he took the suitcase and walked out the door, the finality of the moment hit me. I had loved this man, trusted him with my heart, and he had shattered it into pieces. But in that moment of confrontation, I also found a strength I didn't know I had. The strength to stand up for myself and to walk away from what was no longer healthy or right for me. The house was quiet once he left, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the sound of a chapter closing, a painful yet necessary end. As I sat down, letting the tears finally come, I knew that the road ahead would be tough. But for the first time in a long while, I also felt a glimmer of hope. The hope of a new beginning, one where I could rebuild and find myself again. In the weeks following Mark's departure, the house felt both empty and strangely full. Full of the echoes of a life we once shared, now shattered by betrayal. The process of filing for divorce was a bureaucratic reminder of the emotional turmoil I was enduring. I met with my lawyer, Ms. Jacobs, a kind but no-nonsense woman. She spread out the papers in front of me, her voice steady and practical. "Emily, given the circumstances, the law is on your side. We'll file for an at-fault divorce citing infidelity. You have a strong case." I nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and resolve. "I just want this to be over," I said quietly. "I understand," she replied. "But remember, this is about protecting your interests, especially considering the disparity in your incomes and contributions to the marriage." The legal proceedings seemed to drag on, but eventually, the day came when the divorce was finalized. Mark and I faced each other in the courthouse, a stark contrast to the last time we were in a public setting together. He looked worn, his eyes avoiding mine. "Emily, he began, his voice trailing off. "There's nothing to say, Mark. It's over," I interrupted, not wanting to revisit the pain. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I never wanted it to end like this." "Neither did I, Mark. But you made your choices," I replied, my voice firm. The judge's gavel signaled the end of our marriage. I was awarded the house and a significant portion of our shared assets, along with a monetary compensation from Mark. It was a hollow victory. The courtroom felt cold and sterile, a far cry from the warm, hopeful place where we had exchanged our vows. After the divorce, I spent many nights revisiting the memories of our time together, trying to make sense of how it all went wrong. But with each passing day, the sharp edges of betrayal began to dull, giving way to a clearer understanding of myself and what I deserved. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Ellis, to navigate through the labyrinth of my emotions. It's important to grieve, Emily. Not just for your marriage, but for the future you thought you'd have, she advised during one of our sessions. I know, I said, a tear sliding down my cheek. But it's hard. Some days I feel so angry, and other days just numb. That's normal. Healing isn't linear, but you're making progress, and that's what counts, Dr. Ellis reassured me. As the weeks turned into months, I began to find solace in small things. A morning jog, a good book, coffee with friends. Life without Mark was different, but it was slowly becoming mine again. I was rediscovering who I was outside the shadow of our marriage. The divorce and its aftermath were a journey through the darkest parts of my heart. But as I emerged on the other side, I realized that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. I had faced betrayal and heartache, and I had not only survived but started to thrive. It was a bittersweet realization, but one that filled me with a sense of hope and a newfound respect for myself. The final chapter of my story is not one of an ending, but rather the beginning of a new journey. The months following the divorce were a time of deep introspection and gradual healing. My home, once a shared space filled with our dreams and plans, slowly transformed into a sanctuary of my own making. One evening, as I sat in the newly redecorated living room, my friend Sarah visited. She looked around, noticing the changes. You've really made this place your own, Emily. It feels so. You, she said, a smile spreading across her face. I smiled back, a sense of pride swelling in my chest. It took a while, but I feel like I'm finally getting there. Making this place mine, finding myself again. Sarah nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. It's been a tough road, but look at you, stronger and more yourself than ever. Our conversation drifted to future plans, dreams I had shelved during my marriage. I've been thinking about starting that bakery I always talked about, I shared, the idea sparking excitement within me. That's fantastic, Emily. It's about time you pursued your passion, Sarah encouraged. Her words bolstered my resolve. The dream of opening a bakery, once a distant wish, now felt like a tangible goal, a piece of the new life I was building. Therapy sessions with Dr. Ellis became a cornerstone of my recovery. During one session, I expressed my newfound sense of hope. I feel like I'm finally moving forward, Dr. Ellis, not just surviving, but actually living. Dr. Ellis smiled, her eyes reflecting her pride in my progress. That's a significant step, Emily. You're not just rebuilding your life. You're redefining it on your own terms. Her words resonated with me. The pain of the past, while not entirely gone, had become a part of my story, not a defining aspect of it. I was learning to embrace life with all its uncertainties and possibilities. As the anniversaries of my would have been wedding day came and went, I found myself reflecting less on what was lost and more on what lay ahead. I started taking baking classes, each session a step closer to my dream. The joy I found in creating something beautiful and delicious from simple ingredients was a metaphor for the new life I was crafting for myself. One afternoon, while experimenting with a new pastry recipe, I realized how far I had come. The kitchen, once a place of shared meals and conversations, was now a space of creativity and growth. I had come to terms with the fact that some chapters in our lives had to close for new ones to open. Moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past or the love I had for Mark. It meant accepting what had happened, learning from it, and allowing myself to grow beyond it. It was about finding joy in the present and hope in the future. It was about understanding that even in the wake of heartbreak, life could be rich and fulfilling. As I put the finishing touches on a batch of pastries, the oven timer dinged, a sound that I had come to associate with accomplishment and new beginnings. I realized that moving forward wasn't just a journey. It was a destination in itself, one where peace, self-discovery, and happiness were waiting. And as I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the sweet aroma of baking, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be.